weekend, 23 August, Weekly Marks, 2 p.m. Saturday. Later this evening, Susanna has promised to provide us at 7 o'clock Eastern Time, perhaps a movie. So if you're listening now, stick around, come back later. Weekly Marks. I've been reading on the weekends Ed George's notes on the Grundrisse. Today we'll probably look at parts 5, 6, and 7 of Ed George's Grundrisse notes, which correlate in the Grundrisse to the chapter on money. And we're skipping part 1 because it's mainly a description of Darimon's theories, and the meat of it, of course, is Marx, and so that's what 5, 6, and 7 begin to talk about money, and of course we will ultimately talk about value and price, all of which are still important to talk about. And I've added the links to David Harvey, and as well as the Internet Marxist archive stuff that's available online. So hopefully this gives you a better sense of how to read the Grundrisse, noting, of course, that we're trying to look at Volume 3 of Capital, as well as the Grundrisse, to get a better sense of probably the pointers to the current issues, the problems of the value form, price and value, and of course the usual, right? The transformation problem, the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, all of those types of things. If you've been looking at my other stuff, I'm going to do a thing on Sunday, I think, about over in Daily Coast about conjuncture, conjecture and conjuncture, the first of which will be introduced this evening. Anyway, so Marx clarifies why he started the manuscript with a critique of Darimont and his theories. And we now have arrived at something a little bit more serious, let's put it that way. The chapter on money, part 2 or 3, depending on how you want to look at it. So I'll start reading this. We'll see how far we get. And I hope you'll, appreciate the similarities or differences among the discussion of money, and then we're going to talk about value and price in a second. Marx clarifies why he started the manuscript with a critique of Darimont and his theories. We've now arrived at the basic question, which is no longer connected with our point of departure. The general question is it possible to revolutionize the existing relations of production and the corresponding relations of distribution, departments 1 and 2, by means of changes in the instrument of circulation, that is, changes in the organization of circulation? Now, a further question, can such a transformation of circulation be accomplished without touching the existing relations of production and the social relations based on them? So a positive answer to this question would be to reveal a misunderstanding concerning the interconnection between the relations of production, the relations of distribution, and the relations of circulation. Marx asks as to whether the various civilized forms of money, that is, metal coinage, paper money, credit notes, labor money, this last as a kind of socialist form, remember this is sort of in relation to Proudhon among others, can achieve what is required of them without abolishing the production relation itself, which is expressed in the category of money, and whether it is not then necessarily a self-defeating effort to seek to overcome the essential conditions of a relationship by effecting a formal modification within it. Marx's answer is no. The various forms of money may correspond better to social production at various stages of its development. One form may remove certain shortcomings with which the other cannot cope, but none of them, so long as they remain forms of money, and so long as money remains an essential relation of production, can resolve the contradictions inherent in the money relationship. They can all only express these contradictions in one form or another. That being said, I was just testing the microphone. Thank you very much. Darimont identifies money circulation with credit, which is an economic fallacy. All that Darimont, in fact, establishes is that the banks which deal in credit, like the merchants who deal in commodities or the workers who deal in labor, sell at a higher price when demand rises in relation to supply, i.e., they make it more difficult for the public to obtain their services at the very moment when the public most needs them. That this is the case, as we've seen, has nothing to do with whether or not the notes issued by the bank are convertible or not. In addition, Darimont, oh, in addition, Darimont errs when he seems to imagine that the bank regulates of its monopoly. This is not the case, argues Marx. The power of the bank only begins where the power of the private escompteur, the discounters, ends. That is, at a moment when its own power is already extraordinarily limited. The bank can set a discount rate, but if the private discounters set a lower one, then the escompteurs, instead of emulating the bank, would discount all of its business away under its very nose. Finally, Darimont proposes to, in his own words, end the privilege enjoyed by gold and silver of being the only authentic instruments of circulation and exchange. Gold and silver should become commodities just like any other, or to be precise, all commodities should become instruments of exchange of the same rank, so that products be truly exchanged for products. Money in its most perfect state is paper money, says Darimont, quoting Ricardo. Quote, let the papacy remain, but make everyone pope, says Marx. Do away with money by turning every commodity into money and endowing it with the specific properties of money. Now, but Marx asks, quote, does not the bourgeois system of exchange itself make a specific instrument of exchange necessary? Does it not of necessity create a special equivalent of all values? One form of this instrument of exchange or of this equivalent may be handier, more appropriate, entail further inconveniences than another, but the inconveniences resulting from the existence of a special instrument of exchange, of a special and yet general equivalent, are bound to reproduce themselves, if in different ways, in every form. Darimont ignores that question. When there's a drain of bullion, gold bullion, the real contradiction that the precious metals are not merely commodities like all the others comes to the fore. Modern political economy is suddenly shocked always to find itself temporarily back among the prejudices of mercantilism, close quote. Now, what might occasion a drain of bullion? Well, ship sinks or something, right? A bad harvest at home of some food staple, or a bad harvest abroad of a mass consumption good, tea, for example, and a consequent rise in price. A failure in the harvest of a industrial raw material like cotton, wool, silk, flax, excessive imports caused by speculation or war. Now, take the case of a bad grain harvest. Comparing the nation affected with another, not only is its real wealth, but also its capital are diminished. The resulting rise in the price of grain will apparently leave everything in value terms as it was before, except that the reduced quantity of grain multiplied by the increased price in case of real bad harvests never equals the normal quantity multiplied by the lower price. Marx now develops another strange numerical example whose purpose is not transparently obvious. Now, suppose the production of wheat were to fall by 1/2 and that this quantity is sell for the same price as the original crop. If we assume that the original crop requires 2 times or 2x working days for its reproduction, then the nation would effectively exchange 2x working days, that is the cost of production, for x working days, the price of the product. The productive power of the capital would have declined by 1/2. The sum of the values owned in the country would have been reduced for each working day, would have depreciated by 1/2. Every item of capital will now represent only 1/2 of its former value of its equivalent in cost of production, even if the nominal value of the nation's capital would remain unchanged, because the diminished value of the other products would be exactly compensated for by the increased per unit value of the wheat. So the doubling of the per unit price of wheat would express a twofold depreciation of all other products. So Marx notes that even under conditions of free trade, and even if imported grain were as cheap as the home produced, the nation would be poor to the extent of the capital not reproduced by the farmers. Remember, this is happening prior, I think. Well, no, this is after the Corn Laws are taken out. If grain rises in price, then relatively, the prices of all the other commodities will fall. The increased production costs represented by the price at which a quarter of grain is obtained imply a reduction in the productivity of the capital that exists in all other forms. More spent on grain means less available for other products and therefore fall in their prices. All this has nothing to do with the metallic basis of the currency. So this is, there's an autonomy here. Now, Proudhon claims, says Marx, that the crisis occurs because it is only the precious metals which possess value. But all the rise in the price of grain means is that more gold and silver are required for a given quantity of grain. That is, the price of grain has risen relative to gold. Gold falls in price relative to grain. Gold and silver therefore share in the depreciation of all other commodities relative to grain, from which no privilege protects them. Remember, these are Ed George's notes, and there's a lot of stuff that sort of underlies this. And the footnotes, I think, are kind of important, although they kind of drone on. Although this is, this is the problem with reading the Grundrisse. There are a lot of notes there. I hope my microphone is still running. Testing, 1, 2, 3. I guess it is. Neither is it the case that the fact that gold is coined gives it any particular privilege. A thaler, silver remains under all circumstances a thaler. So does a bushel of wheat remain a bushel, and a yard of linen remains a yard. Marx draws the following conclusions from what he's just argued. The depreciation of most commodities, labor included, and the ensuing crisis in the case of a significant failure of the grain harvest cannot therefore be naively ascribed to the export of gold, since the depreciation and the crisis would occur even if no domestic gold were exported and no foreign grain imported. The crisis reduces itself simply to the law of supply and demand, which, as we all know, operates much more sharply and energetically in the sphere of primary necessities, that is, at the national level, than in all other spheres. The export of gold is not the cause of the grain crisis, but the grain crisis is the cause of the export of gold. So there is an asymmetry in direction on this. But gold and silver play a role in aggravating the crisis in 2 ways. First, to the extent that the export of gold is inhibited by the actions of the banks and the prevailing conditions under which they have to operate. And second, insofar as the export of gold becomes necessary because it's the only means of international payment acceptable. And note, of course, this is why, there's movement away from metallic stuff to talk about paper. and a variety of other instruments. But the point, of course, is to make it fairly simple. Ultimately, when he does capital, he tries to make it moderately simple by first simply talking about metal. Knowing, of course, that he was going to eventually talk about other kinds of financial instruments. During the period that the Bank of England was legally authorized to issue inconvertible notes, the notes fell against bullion, but the mint price of gold also fell against bullion. Gold had become a special kind of commodity as distinct from banknotes. But it is, of course, the case that banknotes are always convertible to gold, even under conditions of the suspension of legal controvertibility, because gold can always be bought. This was the problem in the 1930s in the U.S. when people started going against the gold standard. It can be said that the note remained dependent upon gold insofar as it nominally represented a definite quantity of gold for which, in fact, it was not redeemable. Not redeemable. Gold remained its denominator, although the note was legally no longer exchangeable for this quantity of gold at the bank. So this divergence becomes important, and even more important with larger economies. The debates in Britain between the bullionists and the non-bullionists are therefore not really about the convertibility, but how convertibility works. So this is all Ed George's notes on these, making a kind of position that's, moderately important relative to Keynes, et cetera. Convertibility into gold and silver is, therefore, in practice, the measure of value of any paper currency denominated in terms of gold or silver, whether that currency is legally convertible or not. A nominal value is only a shadow running alongside its body. Whether the two coincide must be proved by the actual convertibility or exchangeability of the note. So Marx notes that in rural Scotland, paper money is actually preferred over metal. Until the 1844 Bank Act was imposed on Scotland in 1845, Scotland suffered the same social crises as England did, and perhaps more sharply, clearly. Yet there was no monetary crisis of note. Quote, there is no depreciation of banknotes, no complaints or investigations as to whether the quantity of currency in circulation was sufficient or not, etc. Scotland shows how the money system on its present basis can be completely regulated. All the evils deplored by Darimont abolished without abandonment of the present social basis, close quote. Nominally, i.e. adds money, gold and silver cannot depreciate when their value falls with regard to other commodities because, as money, they are their own denominator. They're not valued in terms of any third commodity. See footnote 40, but only express fractional parts of their own material. Darimont cannot see this. He can, as a consequence, only see the appreciation of gold and silver against other commodities during a crisis. He cannot see the depreciation of gold and silver against other commodities in periods of prosperity. Convertibility into silver or gold, de facto or de jure, is a requirement for money, i.e., for what is a token of value. Controvertibly equals the token, that is the paper money, to a third commodity. If we imagine that a sovereign, in reality, a given quantity of gold, let us say 1x of an ounce, take the name of X hours of labor time. We thus have 1 over X ounces of gold equals X hours of labor time. But the gold is past labor time that's already been expended. For it to be convertible, it would have to be exchangeable for, that is, be able to purchase X hours of labor time. But this latter thing is not past labor time, but current labor time. Not the labor time incorporated in already produced output, but the currently necessary labor time determines value, says Marx. If a pound of gold is the product of 20 hours labor time, and then, for whatever reason, it becomes possible to produce a pound of gold in 10 hours labor time, the pound of gold denominated equal to 20 hours of labor time is now equal to 10 hours labor time. Quote, gold money with the plebeian denomination X hours of labor would be more subject to fluctuations than any other kind of money, and especially more than the present gold money, because gold cannot rise or fall against gold being equal to itself. While the past labor time embodied in a definite quantity of gold must continually rise or fall against present living labor time. To maintain its convertibility, the productivity of an hour's labor would have to be kept constant. So this is because you want to kind of work out the question of surplus in context. So anyway, given that we would expect labor productivity to rise secularly, constant depreciation would be the inevitable fate of this gold labor money. So what if, to avoid this problem, labor money be made of paper rather than gold? Now, a rise in the productivity of labor would mean a rise in the money's purchasing power. In accordance with the same law by which the gold labor money would be subject to constant depreciation, the paper labor money would enjoy constant appreciation. Now, all of this assumes no, metal coins and that sort of stuff. And the Proudhonite and Owenite socialists would say that that is its advantage. The worker would be glad of the rising productivity of his labor instead of, as now, creating proportionally more alien wealth and his own depreciation. But there's a problem. Quote, once we assume the existence of money, even if only as labor time tickets, we must also assume accumulation of this money in contracts, obligations, interest payments, etc., which would be entered into in terms of this money. Now, this idea of a labor time ticket is sort of an interesting one because it comes back in history several times. So that's the kind of cogitation that Ed George is making as chapter 5 or part 5. And so let us go to part 6. Bloody hell. Which is part 3. 6, the chapter on money. Part 3, value and price. This is pages 74 to 78 in the Grundrisse. These are Ed George's notes. Now, Marx announces a digression. For example, although it's too early, we may make a few remarks about the delusions that underlie the labor time ticket and peer into the deepest secret that links Proudhon's theory of circulation with his general theory. That is, his theory of the determination of value. Now, before he does that, Marx says that, incidentally, if paper money, which is simply a draft on gold, is issued in excess of the gold on which it's a draft, it cannot help but be depreciated. That is, 3 bank drafts of 15 pounds each, to which I issue 3 separate creditors on the same 15 pounds in gold, are in fact only drafts on 15 over 3, that is, pounds, which is 5 pounds each. Each of these notes would therefore be depreciated to 33.33% from the outset. So automatically, there's fractional things come into play, which suggests, a more marginal analysis. That's another topic. The value of a commodity, Marx calls this real exchange value, is determined by its cost of production. In other words, by the labor time required for its production. Its price is this exchange value expressed in money. Replacing metallic money or tokens representing metallic money with labor money, that is denominating labor time, would amount to equating the real value, that is the exchange value of commodities, and their nominal value, price, and money value. The equation of real value and nominal value of value and price. But this equation would only be possible were it the case that the distinction between value and price were only nominal. But it's not only nominal. In fact, you can only accept this nominal thing in certain cases relative to calculation. So, quote, the value of commodities determined by labor time is only their average value, an average which appears as an external abstraction. This abstraction is very real, since it's both the driving force and the moving principle of the fluctuations which occur in the prices of commodities during a particular period of time, close quote. It also constitutes the basis of commercial speculation, where the calculation of probability proceeds from both the mean average price, which is taken at the center as the center of its fluctuations, and the average heights and depths of these fluctuations above or below this center. Now, what Marx calls the market value of a commodity, that is, the value it actually sells at, is always different from its average value. That is, it always stands either below or above it. Marx says, quote, the market value equates itself to the real value by means of its continual fluctuations, not by an equation with real value as some third thing, but precisely through continual inequality to itself. That is, price, therefore, is not the same as value. It's not the same, only in the sense that the nominal is different from the real by means of the former's denomination in gold and silver, but also because value appears as the law of the movements to which the former is subject. So there's something else going on there. If price and value do coincide, they only do so quite fortuitously and exceptionally. The price of a commodity will always stand above or below its value, such that the value of commodities itself exists only in the ups and downs of commodity prices. While commodity prices are determined by supply and demand, you see, this is that issue of it's not produced, right? It doesn't represent production in that sense. It represents something that on the distribution side, on the circulation side. So while commodity prices are determined by supply and demand, which never coincide or do so only accidentally, production costs, the labor time required for the commodity's production, determine for their part the fluctuations of supply and demand. Now, in turn, the gold or silver in which the price of a commodity, its market value is expressed, is itself a particular quantity of stored up labor, a certain measure of materialized labor time. This is that congealment problem. If, therefore, the production costs of the commodity and of the gold and silver remain constant, the rise or fall of its market price means only that a commodity equal to X labor time continually commands on the market something more or less than X labor time stands above or below its average value determined by labor time. So there's an indeterminacy sort of that goes on here, and the connection between these two is not at a kind of a direct exchange, but rather at something more removed, and that signifies the issue and difference that Marx develops between labor and labor time, or labor power, labor time, labor power, and its relation to relative and absolute surplus value. In other words, there's a way of thinking about this, because it is a kind of increasing abstraction at scale, is to try and figure out, well, okay, what's being cleaved off from the poor worker, and how is it being, sort of taken, however you want to call that. So that's one of the issues. I mean, there are other issues. Let us stand back a little from this and take a look at what Marx has just said. Now, the following very important ideas stand out. That is, number one, the value of a commodity, what Marx here calls its real exchange value, is determined by labor time required for its production. Department 1. Number 2, what determines real value is not the labor time previously incorporated, but the currently necessary labor time. So nothing's getting stored up, let's put it that way. Number 3, the expression of the value of a commodity in money is its price. That is, its nominal value. It's not a real value necessarily. It's a nominal value, because we're, sort of only looking at one component in a system of components. Number 4, value is an average whose appearance is an external abstraction. Now, this external abstraction is the commodity's price. It follows that price, a sum of money, is the phenomenal manifestation of labor time. It's not labor time itself. It's a phenomenal manifestation of labor time, a quantity of person hours, its appearance in the Hegelian sense. price here is therefore now the analog of exchange value and capital, and real value here, that of value. So yes, this could be sleight of hand. It appears, kind of mystical or magical, but it's not that. It's simply that if we accept sort of the Hegelian logic of it, it's not that these things sit separately, but that they are all sort of interdependent, and we sort of are looking at it in a contingent way. So number 5, if the value of a commodity is an average, that is, it's the average, a time average of the variation of its money price over time. Number 6, the price of a commodity varies over time because of the action of supply and demand. This is, just happens at any given moment. Under the effect of supply and demand, a commodity will have a given price. But, this can be a problem because this is relating to the market value. That is, its market value. But market value will coincide with price only quite fortuitously and exceptionally. So this is a more, it's good when it does, but, there's no guarantee that it will, because it is, in that sense, quite externally contingent relative to your making an analysis of it. So 7, thus real value, that is the same thing that Smith is talking about in terms of natural price, in its phenomenal form of price, i.e. the external abstraction. Remember, we're talking about it at a remove, is an average because it is the average of the market value. Now, this is what Marx means when he says that the market value equates itself to the real value by means of its continual fluctuations, not by an equation with real value as some third thing. That's what, Ed George was sort of referring to above, but precisely through continual inequality to itself. So this is a kind of uncertainty of some kind, right? It's not something real specific. It constantly is being assessed because that's kind of how the market operates. Now, number 8, why this average price should actually be the phenomenal form of the quantity of labor time required for the commodity's production and not some other quantity of labor time is explained by the fact that it is precisely the quantity of labor time required for the commodity's production, that is the cost, this is cost price, the cost of production, that determine the fluctuations of supply and demand. The whole business here is that you can identify certain numbers, but some are contingent on, this dynamic situation. And anytime you start to sort of talk about it as a specific thing or a specific price, you're only making a kind of abstract set of relations, and it's not always that number. It's always shifting. And yes, that doesn't seem very precise, but the reality is that there is this constant sort of sense of it. In that way, this is kind of Marx before or pre-calculus Marx that is trying to, kind of handle these differences. So the first real illusion brought about by labor time, chits, tickets, tokens, is that by expressing labor time in terms of itself instead of in a particular objectification of labor time, say, for example, gold and silver, they suppose the abolition of this nominal distinction between exchange value and price, which, will just make you more confused, but you have to sort of be able to see this in kind of, in context. Why is it an illusion in the first place? Because the nominal distinction is also a difference of magnitude. That is, the given price of a commodity is never equal or is only quite so fortuitously and exceptionally to its average price, its real value. So the point here is that the value is not being, there's a kind of agency relation here, is that, it seems magical that the prices appear, but the fact is this entire dynamic system requires all of these sets of relations. So, quote, the labor time ticket, which represents the average labor time, would never correspond to the actual labor time and never be convertible into it. That is, the labor time objectified in a commodity would never command a quantity of labor money equal to itself and vice versa. it would command more or less justice. Just now, each fluctuation of market values is expressed as a rise or fall in their gold and silver prices. The point here is that Marx wants to continue to emphasize this question of a social relation. And yes, it's not fully embodied, but there is a kind of contingency in all of these matters. And it is because it's happening among not only just things, but it's also among people, or people and things, and not just things. I mean, in other words, they're not kind of operating by themselves. Chickens don't, leap up on the counter. Other things have to occur. And then there's the matter, over a longer time period, of the continuous rise in the productivity of labor and the consequent depreciation of commodities compared to the labor time tickets. So, for both of these reasons, the inconvertibility of the labor time tickets is nothing but another expression of the inconvertibility between real value and market value, exchange value and price. The labor time ticket would represent an ideal labor time, and even though the representation of an ideal is what money does it as the representation of the third commodity, this is just hypothetical, the silver, the gold, and not as a measure of itself. So throughout all this little analysis here, you have a kind of automatic separation where you have to see, something that's kind of illusory and something that's a little bit more material all at the same time, which you should be able to imagine. And in some ways, that's what Marx via Hegel is expecting you to do. You should be able to see these things as having a kind of it's manifest, but it's nothing that you can kind of control. It has a certain structure, but your agency relative to it isn't quite all connected. So money prices do express the disjunction between price and value, but they do so in a concealed form. Now, what does the concealing is precisely the third commodity. Now, this third commodity means other things. Remember, we talked about the money commodity as a way in which you kind of can talk about this, but even then, as a number, is not always, as fixed as you might want it. The distinction between price and value between the commodity as measured by the labor time of which it is the product and the product of the labor time for which it is exchanged, this distinction demands a third commodity as a measure in which the real exchange value of the commodity is expressed. So the point here is that you're communicating things, right? Could be gold, could be prices, could be all kinds of things. But the fact is, there's a difference between how things are expressed and how things are communicated. And that's with all due respect, that's a semiotic distinction that's actually pretty important. And by making that distinction, it addresses what Marx is trying to get forward and what Ed George is referring to, this difference between things that appear to be one way, but they're kind of linked to other things. So their appearance is a little bit indeterminate in that sense. All right, quote, because price does not equal value, the element determining value, that is labor time, cannot be the element in which prices are expressed. For labor time would have to express itself at once as the determining and the non-determining element, as the equivalent and the non-equivalent of itself. So you see, it seems uncertain or not so stable. And, that means, well, you could say, well, he's just, bullshitting you. But the idea is he wants to express the kind of dynamic nature of the way in which this operates, because otherwise you're going to, default into mercantilism of some kind. That it's really not how capital operates. Capital operates because it disintegrates these sets of relations. Because labor time as a measure of value exists only ideally, it cannot serve as the material for the comparison of prices. Remember, labor time is a kind of abstraction. And this is during the moment where he's trying to work through, there's labor, which is, the actual expending of energy and muscles and, blood and blah, blah, blah. Um, and the question of labor power, which is a set of capacities or capabilities or expectations about what counts as labor. So this entire abstraction process does have a material element because you have to think about it. I mean, you're not thinking about it in total isolation because you're you're dealing with stuff like people or capitalists or bosses or whatever. So there is some material reality to this. It's not wholly, sort of illusory in that sense. Price, as distinct from value, is necessarily money price. Here it becomes clear that the nominal distinction between price and value is conditioned by their real distinction. So there's always this material relation that's going on here. Now, I know that may be complicated for some people, but you need to get this sense of how active or inactive it is, partially because sometimes, particularly in the neoclassical sense, a lot of this gets kind of reified in weird ways, particularly when you start using math. It appears that certain things are going on, and the only way you get to figure it out is certain mathematical relationships. That is, changes in signs, that is from positive to negative or deflection or some other kind of thing, and which is all intelligible from a mathematical point of view. But when you get to to reality, it doesn't always correspond, which is why neoclassical economics is problematic relative to classical, or the difference between orthodox and heterodox is, you're trying to get a grip on reality as opposed to constantly working through a system of abstractions, which works really nicely from a mathematical point of view, but does not necessarily measure what's going on in reality because it's still about reality. Now, I know that may seem a little complicated, and I hope we can move to the next thing without getting too terribly crazy. But let's just see whether we can or we can't. Let's see. All right. So we looked at 5 and 6 chapters on money. Let's see what 7 looks like, and then we'll be able to stop. This is moving further on, and yes, it continues to roll on because Marx is worried about this. He doesn't want to just sort of say, well, it's this magical thing and it's dynamic and blah, blah, blah. He wants to sort of get a handle on it in a way that you can sort of deal with the actual data in a reasonable way. And he's dealing with 19th century data that is problematic for all of its own reasons. It's trade, it's colonialism, it's imperialism ultimately, but it's all of those things at once that it's sort of nice that you can kind of get it to work out at one level, but that Marx is unsettled by this, that all these numbers are fine, but in some ways the reality, that is people's ability to sustain themselves, is kind of at contradiction often, and Marx is trying to come to grips with that, because you can have all these things work out well at the level of a commodity, but the commodity's relation to actual human beings is made problematic partially by this set of things under capitalism. All right. If commodity A equals 1 shilling and 1 shilling equals 1 over X, let's suppose ounces of silver, and commodity B equals 2 shillings, 2 over X of silver, for example, then commodity B is of twice the value of commodity A. That is, the value relationship between A and B is expressed by the proportion in which each exchanges against a definite quantity of a third commodity, not against a value relationship. See, there's a difference that's being drawn here. So each commodity, whether it's a product intended for unproductive consumption or an article of productive consumption, is equal to, quote, the objectification of a particular amount of labor time. So already there's an abstraction here that you sort of need to get a handle on. The proportion is in which it is exchanged for other commodities, or other commodities are exchanged for it, is equal to the amount of labor time realized in it. A commodity which is equal to 1 hour's labor time can be exchanged for any other commodity which is equal to 1 hour's labor time. And it's not the same thing as labor, remember. So, this is that abstraction, a certain set of expectations about the abstraction as opposed to about reality. Assuming, of course, Marx reminds us that exchange value equals market value and that real value equals price. If you can see the difference here, exchange value equals market value, which is perfectly reasonable, and that real value equals price. Now, real value and price, this is only a contingent relation, knowing, of course, that price constantly is moving around, and that's kind of what Marx is trying to work through. But the value of a commodity is different from the commodity itself. A commodity becomes value only in exchange, whether it's real or whether it's imagined. The value of a commodity is both its exchangeability in general and its specific exchangeability. It, that is value, is at once the indicator of the ratio in which the commodity exchanges for others and the indicator of the ratio in which it has already been exchanged for others. That is, this is, where labor time becomes more material in the process of production. So we're not looking yet at Department 2. We're all still fiddling around with mainly Department 1, even though we're talking about markets. All right, if you can sort of grasp that. Because remember, this is the Grundrisse. It happens before Marx sort of works through the things that we see that Engels puts back together in Volume 2, Volume 3, blah, 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 blah. Value is a commodity's quantitative determined exchangeability. Different commodities are different in that they possess different properties. That can get really complicated, of course. They are measured in different units and are, as such, incommensurable. Marx does not use the term use value, but that's what he means here. Now, commensurability is a much bigger word and much more complicated because it has both a concrete and an abstract sense that you need to sort of appreciate that in science, the commensurability issue is really, really important. I mean, it actually underlies whether you're going to have a science or not. And so Ed George using the word commensurable here is trying to push it in that kind of direction. So different commodities are different in that they possess different properties. They're measured in different units and are, as such, incommensurable. This is not controversial. But as values, they are qualitatively equal and quantitatively, and only quantitatively different. So qualitatively equal and only quantitatively different. Hence, they can be measured in terms of each other and are mutually replaceable. In neoclassical terms, this is substitutability as well. It's not necessarily substitutability, but you can see that that's a kind of possibility anyway. So exchangeable, convertible into each other in definite quantitative proportions. There's a lot going on there. And neoclassical economics, particularly micro, will try and, get a better handle on it. But, there are problems there that are sort of unique to what's called micro foundational issues. Anyway, the value of commodities is both their social relationship and their economic quality. Different kinds of otherwise incommensurable commodities, that is, effectively different use values, are as values mutually exchangeable in given ratios. You see, it could be, different kinds of otherwise incommensurable commodities that is effectively different use values, are as values mutually exchangeable in given ratios. So as a value, a commodity is a quote unquote equivalent, and as an equivalent, its natural properties disappear. Now, as value, the commodity is money, but the commodity as a product here is synonymous with what Marx will later call use value, is distinct from the commodity as a value, and the commodity as a value is distinct from the commodity as a product. I know sounds like double talk, but the point he's trying to make here is that's this, whatever the special quality, the uniqueness, the autonomy of money that it does, this is the fungibility issue. It is something different, and yet it's the same, or that it can be used to represent stuff. And this is why Marx is trying to create these separate categories, what seem to be categories, but they're not autonomous categories. They are, intersections of an interesting sort. All right. So, but the commodity as a product, that is, product here is synonymous with what Marx will later call use value, is distinct from the commodity as a value, and the commodity as a value is distinct from the commodity as a product. The commodity in one of its guises is distinct from itself. So that already sounds schizophrenic, but what we're looking at here is the multiplicity of meaning and of value, how value aggregates some of these kinds of elements. Thus, since the commodity as a value is qualitatively distinct from itself as a value, and as a value is qualitatively similar to other commodities, its value requires a qualitatively distinct existence from itself. Quote, the commodity's value, therefore, must have an existence qualitatively distinguishable from it, and in the actual exchange, this separability must become an actual separation, because the natural distinctions between commodities must come into contradiction with their economic equivalents. The two can exist alongside each other only through the commodity acquiring a dual existence. That is, a natural existence, and alongside it, a purely economic one, in which it is a mere sign, a letter for a relationship of production, a mere symbol for its own value, unquote. Now, right in this whole thing here is what semiotics is about. You have things that are palpable, material matter, but you have a multiplicity of meanings that can be associated with, this kind of idea of a commodity. I know that may sound horribly, wacky, but I would assert to you that that's a possible element. All righty. As I'm almost done. As a value on the one hand and a product that is its natural existence, Marx also calls it an actual commodity. Wirkliche Ware. On the other hand, the commodity behaves in quite different ways. As a value, it's uniformly divisible. As a product, it isn't. As a value, it's immutable through its metamorphoses. As a product, it's only exchanged in the first place because it's qualitatively different to other commodities. I mean, you can sort of distinguish it from another thing. As a value, it is general. As a product, it is a particular. As a value, its exchangeability is determined by itself. As a product, by virtue of its natural properties and the demand for it. In short, all the properties that are enumerated for particular properties of money are properties of the commodity as exchange value. Properties of the product as value as distinct from the value as product. Marx ventures now to label the exchange value of the commodity a special existence alongside the commodity itself. That is, money, the form in which all commodities are equated, compared, measured, the form into which all commodities are dissolved, and which dissolves itself in all commodities, the general equivalent. In calculations, accountancy, etc., commodities are transformed into symbols of value and abstracted from their material existence. This is the problem of depreciation, for example. In exchange, this transformation needs to be carried out through a real mediation, that is, a means by which this abstraction is effected. As a product in its natural properties, a commodity is not universally exchangeable. To be so, we must first convert it into itself as exchange value in order to compare and exchange this exchange value with others. You see, it already sounds like double talk, but what you need to get a sense of is that you can look at one thing and consider that it has a multiplicity of possibilities that are kind of worked out in its social relationship. So Marx cites the case of a West African tribe who barter by equating products according to their worth to a given number of quote unquote bars. In this way, goods are valued before they're exchanged, and in order to be valued, they must be brought into a definite numerical relationship with each other. Effectively, the goods in this way are given a price. So bars, are just things, conch shells or something. Products only exchange as commodities, and in exchange, commodities only exist as values, otherwise they're not comparable. In exchange, each commodity is equated to a quote-unquote third thing, and like this, each is posited as unequal to itself. So this is, this little separation, this third thing, distinct from the other two, since it expresses a ratio, exists initially in the head, that is, in your imagination. For the comparison of commodities, this abstraction is sufficient. In the actual exchange, the abstraction must be objectified, symbolized, realized through a token. How much money do you have in your pocket? How much money do you have in the bank? Blah, blah, blah. The commodity must be exchanged for a third thing, which is not itself a particular commodity, but the symbol of the commodity as commodity, the commodity as such, of the commodity's exchange value itself, which therefore represents, say, labor time as such. A piece of paper or leather, which represents a certain portion of labor time. Now, the existence of a symbol of this type, a symbol which represents certain portions of labor time, is itself a result of exchange. The symbol replaces the mediating commodity of which it is a symbol. So once this happens, the symbol now becomes the conscious token of exchange value. Quote, hence, the process is simply this. The product becomes a commodity, i.e. a mere element of exchange. The commodity is transformed into exchange value. In order to equate it with itself as exchange value, it's exchanged for a token, which represents it as an exchange value as such. As such symbolized exchange value, it can then be exchanged again in certain proportions with any other commodity. Although the product becoming a commodity and the commodity becoming exchange value, it acquires first in our mind a dual existence. This mental duplication proceeds and must proceed to the point where the commodity appears dual in actual exchange as natural product on the one hand, as exchange value on the other, i.e., its exchange value acquires an existence materially separated from it. So, it all sounds like double talk, but it's interaction you have has all of these elements sort of working through it. I hope I haven't lost the audio. It appears to still work, I think. Yep. Okay. We're almost at the end. Marx now comments a little obliquely. The material used to express the symbol is a matter of some consequence, however varied it's been historically. As society develops, it also evolves. Along with the symbol, the material that more and more corresponds to the symbol, although it later strives to free itself from that material again. A symbol, if it is not arbitrary, requires certain conditions as regards the material in which it's presented. Thus, for example, the signs for words possess a history, alphabetic script, etc. So he's making a philological comment here, and that's worth talking about in some other context. So, if money is the result of exchange value, then it's impossible to abolish complications and contradictions arising from the existence of money alongside specific commodities by changing the form of money. This is the gold versus paper. Neither is it possible to abolish money itself so long as exchange value remains the social form of products. So the point being is that, there are certain things that have that materiality, and it's contingent on these other things. So Marx lists the following properties of money. Number one, a measure of commodity exchange, i.e., a standard of price. Number two, a means of exchange, not the same thing. And number three, a representative of commodities for that reason as the object of contracts. You see, there's that other set of meanings that comes with it, the set of contingencies, i.e., a means of payment. It's a sort of a promissory relation, which becomes more problematic in currency exchange. But anyway, number four, a universal commodity existing alongside the particular ones, universal, particular, specific, right? I don't know if there's that difference. Remember the Hegelian difference between the universal, the general, the particular, and the singular. Remember, there's three things, which is kind of what we're trying to work through. A function which includes money's role as a store of value. These are properties which follow simply from money's role as objectified exchange value, separated from the commodities themselves. Remember, that's the difference between commodities and commodity money. To the extent that the social level of production develops along capitalist lines such that every producer becomes dependent upon the exchange value of his commodity, i.e., the more the product really becomes exchange value, and exchange value becomes the immediate object of production, the more must money relationships develop, and with them the contradictions imminent in money relationships, imminent in the relationship of the product to itself as money. Alongside this, there appears a growth in the power of money. This is where it gets back to the issue of labor power, right? I.e., the exchange relation establishes itself as a power external to and independent of the producers. The exchange relation passes from being a means to facilitate production to something alien. What originally appeared as a means to promote production turns into a relationship alien to the producers. In proportion as the producers become dependent upon exchange, exchange appears to become independent of them. It appears to become independent of them. The rift between the product as product and the product as exchange value begins to widen. Money does not create this opposition and this contradiction. On the contrary, their development creates the apparently transcendental power of money. Marx now asks, does not the existence of money alongside commodities contain from the outset contradictions inherent in the very relationship? Marx answers in the affirmative and gives four reasons. First, he'll argue that there is a contradiction imminent to the dual nature of the commodity itself. Second, he will say that alongside this, and as a consequence, the act of exchange itself contains an imminent and contradictory dual nature. Number three, third, and there now appears a contradiction within exchange between the subjects of exchange, that is, the people who do the exchanging, and the very act of exchange. So you have this other thing going on. Finally, fourthly, he will argue that all this manifests itself within the medium, that is, the mediator of exchange, money itself, between its generality as universal exchangeability, the US dollar, and its particularity as a commodity, even if it's only a representation of a commodity. Marx's question is as to the imminent possibility of crisis. So the whole thing about all of this indeterminacy is that, this can cause chaos. Here are his arguments. Number one, the commodity has a dual existence as a particular object and exchange value, and as exchange value. In its existence as product, its exchange value is latent. In its existence as exchange value, its particularity as product is discarded. This dual nature expresses itself as a contradiction between the commodity's particular natural properties on the one hand and its social exchangeability on the other. This is a contradiction because these two separate forms of existence of the commodity are not mutually convertible. As soon as money is an external thing alongside the commodity, the exchangeability of the commodity for money is immediately linked to external conditions, which may or may not be present. This is, when the auto salesman tries to sell you undercoating. There is no guarantee that the commodity will be exchanged. Whether, therefore, the commodity is convertible into money depends upon circumstances which have no immediate connection with it as exchange value and are independent of it. The convertibility of the commodity depends upon the natural properties of the product. That of money coincides simply with its existence as symbolized exchange value. Number two, exchange consists of two acts, as it does, buying and selling, separated from one another in space and time. That's the kind of why Harvey's obsessed with this, right? They may correspond or not. They may coincide or not. Disparities may occur between them. So it's all that, it's indeterminate in that. Number three, the separation of buying and selling into two independent acts supposes that the general movement of exchange be separated from the exchangers. We talked about that before, i.e., from the producers of the commodity, exchange for the sake of exchange is separated from exchange for the sake of commodities. Under these conditions appears an estate of merchants, which buys only in order to sell. These are middle people, right? And sells only in order to buy. Again, aiming in this operation not at the possession of the commodities as products. They don't give a crap, but merely at the acquisition of exchange value as such of money. This is like ticket scalpers, yeah? On the basis of this duality, exchange for the sake of consumption and exchange for the sake of exchange, there appears another contradiction. The circulation of commodities between merchants and that between merchants and consumers are determined by quite different laws and motives. And the greatest contradiction can develop between them. Yeah, like, the scalper is selling counterfeit tickets, for example. Marx notes here the appearance of the quote-unquote money business. Number four, the emergence of money as the general commodity alongside particular, that is, non-money commodities occurs through the emergence of a particular commodity, which is money. In this way, money comes into contradiction with itself and its determination because it is itself a particular commodity, even if only a symbol. And thus, in an exchange with other commodities, again, subject to particular conditions of exchange which contradict its universal unconditional exchangeability. So this is that problem of, well, I know I have money in the bank, but my bank statement, is it's a pain in the ass. There's a problem. It's causing a crisis. Marx summarizes, quote, we see then how it is inherent in money to fulfill its purposes by simultaneously negating them, to make itself independent in relation to commodities, to turn itself from a means into an end, to realize the exchange value of commodities by separating them from it, to facilitate exchange by splitting it, to overcome the difficulties of the direct exchange of commodities by generalizing them, to render exchange independent of the producers to the same extent as the producers become dependent on exchange. This is that problem of trusting whether you've sent something off and that it arrives and that you get paid for it, or vice versa. Then he says this, again, obliquely and in parentheses, quote, it'll later be necessary before leaving this question to correct the idealist manner of presentation, which makes it appear as if it were merely a matter of the definitions of concepts and the dialectic of these concepts. Above all, the phrase, the product or activity becomes a commodity. The commodity becomes exchange value. The exchange value becomes money. Ah, criminy. So I got to the end, and I went slightly over. I hope you can appreciate what's going on here, because at this, this is a Grundrisse, so he's really working through this problem, which he gets along further in when capital is put together. So there's eventually when he gets to front loading it, he manages to exclude some of this processing, but it's still there. But I would assert to you that by reading the Grundrisse, and by looking at Ed George's notes on the Grundrisse, you can see kind of what's going on. I mean, he does describe it in this way in Capital Volume 1.
And your mic went away.
Oh, crap.
It's very low.
All right. Well, I'm
There
going
you
to,
go.
yeah, I'm going to stop anyway. So I got to the end. I've included in the page uh, the David Harvey component. That's at the end. And also the link to the Marxist the internet version of this. So the source being, of course, the Penguin version, which is on in the internet, and I recommend to you reading the Grundrisse with David Harvey, because there's a reason why he does it. There's a reason why we return to it. In some ways, it is a more authentic, or with all due respect, a non-Engels approach to stuff, and you sort of need to get a feeling for it, if nothing else, to see where the differences are. Not that Engels is wrong or anything. It's just simply it's just of a piece. So anyway, all righty. So here we will cut the live stream, and then